All right, I have 3:15. So let's get started talking about silver. I think that the most important slide I have in the presentation is this first one here. Because really, when we talk about accessibility, we're talking about people. So although we are going to cover a lot of technical aspects of the silver WCAG 3.0 guideline, I believe it's important to always keep people at the forefront of what we do. The other thing you'll notice is that I'm using the closed captioning that is available in PowerPoint for this presentation. It is not perfect. So you may see some interesting transcription of what I'm saying, and I apologize up front. So let's get started. I am Bryan Trogdon, and that is Bryan with a Y. And I have been working in the design and UX space for about 20 years. I have led the accessibility efforts with companies like Office Depot. And I currently am leading the digital accessibility efforts with NCR. In my role as the digital accessibility program manager, I am a member of the Information Technology Industry Council, which is the policy institution that provides the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, or VPAT. I also am participating in the Silver Community Group for the W3C. So the key question is, what is silver? And in short, it is the next evolution of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it will be 3.0. Now, Web Accessibility Content Guidelines is a mouthful. So we shortened that to WCAG. And one of the things that we have seen with accessibility guidelines is they have evolved beyond just supporting web content. And so when you remove the WC from the abbreviation, you end up with AG, which is the 47th element of the periodic table, and that is silver. So that is where the code name came from. So that helps us understand where we are headed. But I think it's also very important to understand how we got there. And that has been a journey of almost 50 years. And it starts back in 1973 with the Rehabilitation Act. And this really was one of the first civil rights acts really targeted around people with disabilities. And this was really the start of treating individuals with disabilities as first-class citizens. What we've seen then is in 1990 is when we've seen the Americans with Disability Act was brought about. And really what this did is it supported accessibility best practices like curb ramps and curb cuts. And what's interesting is everybody benefited from these advancements. If you've ever had to pull luggage that's on rollers or push a child in a stroller, you know how nice it is when you come up to a curb and it has this accessible access provided. And we are continuing to see that today, where when we design for accessibility, we benefit everybody. As we move forward in time, we get to 1998, where Section 508 was added to the Rehabilitation Act. And really, this addressed the fact that a large portion of our lives was being spent using technology. And so this Section 508 really addressed access more at a federal level for individuals with accessibility. And then a year later, when we take a look at 1999, is really when the first guidelines for the WCAG was introduced. What was really interesting is that America Online accounted for 39% of the traffic on the web at that time, which is crazy to think about. But that was how we got online. It would be almost 10 years later before we would see the next iteration of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines come out, and how we access the web had changed. Just a year earlier, Steve Jobs had introduced the iPhone, and the whole concept of what an accessible web experience was transformed. So the standards are constantly chasing these advancements in technology. It would be another 10 years before the next iteration of the WCAG guidelines was introduced with 2.1. And again, we have seen that the way that we consume web content was being transformed with the introduction of smart speakers. So I hope you're seeing that there's a trend here in that these accessibility guidelines are never static. They're always evolving to support the evolution of our technology and how we consume content. So as we think about where these guidelines are going to be in a few years, the next big change is going to be in 2021. Now, this has nothing to do with Harry Potter. This is just simply how I'm going to look at the end of this year. Big and hairy. You're a wizard, Bryan. Wow, right? So this guideline is going to be something that will, again, transform the way we provide accessible content. And we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. And then 50 years after the Rehabilitation Act. WCAG 3.0 will be introduced. Part of one of the technologies that it will support is XR, or virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality. So where do all these guidelines come from? The W3C is the governing body that produces these guidelines, and they have offices all around the world. They also have host locations that help with the creation of these guidelines. And a lot of the work for silver is coming out of MIT. When we think about the WCAG 2.2 guideline, which again will be out about the middle of next year, it really extends the WCAG 2.x series. It will be backwards compatible, and it really leverages the existing conformance models that we have been using for the accessibility guidelines for the past 10 or so years. It does start taking into consideration some new disabilities like cognitive disabilities, low vision, and motor disabilities. So when you think about how to support those, it will start to transform the scope of what support is. This is the list of the new guidelines that are in 2.2. And the one that I think is really interesting is the accessible authentication. And so what that guideline states is that if an authentication process relies on a cognitive function test, at least one other method must also be available that does not rely on a cognitive function test. So if you have a login process that requires a username and password, to be accessible, you will need another process that does not require someone to remember their username and password. That is where single sign-on or biometrics starts to become an example of an accessible authentication process. Dragging is going to involve that if you can rearrange content by clicking and dragging it on the screen, you'll need to provide a keyboard equivalent for that feature in order to be accessible. Also, things like pointer target spacing. This is going to dictate the size around a target to make it easier for someone with a mobility challenge like Parkinson's or such to be able to use your application. So these guidelines are coming next year. What does that mean? The 2.2 guidelines will include all of the previous 2.0 and 2.1 guidelines. The US government, Section 508, did not adopt the WCAG 2.1, so it is in question whether they would adopt 2.2. However, the European Union standard, the EN 301549, did adopt 2.1, and it is reasonable to expect that they would consider adoption of 2.2. What we saw is that advocates of accessibility requested conformance of the new 2.1 guideline within the first year. And again, we've got some runway to start getting familiar with this guideline because it is going to be here about the middle of next year. So let's talk a little bit about WCAG 3.0. And we all know 3 is a magic number. The WCAG 3.0 guideline will be a successor to the previous guidelines. It will not be backwards compatible. And it does away with the A, AA, AAA guidelines and replaces them with bronze, silver, and gold. It also introduces holistic testing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it truly does provide a way to test and measure the usability of your product with assistive technology. That is something that we have not done in the past. So this provides a general schematic of the guidelines for 3.0. And this is confusing to look at, but I think we can dissect it a little bit to help it make more sense. So one of the things to look at first is functional needs. And so this is going to be a way to express the condition that people encounter. An example would be you want to support the use of your application or product for people without vision. And it is informed, again, by the European Union standard and the Section 508 standard. It then allows you to put together your functional categories, which are a high-level grouping of disabilities to aid in testing and remediation. An example would be vision and visual. And again, as the new standard starts adopting some of these additional disabilities, you'll see things like color contrast will go away, and it will be visual contrast. So it is going to have a change in the way you think and look at accessibility. From the functional needs, these combine with guidelines to inform the outcomes. And the guidelines are solutions to functional needs across technologies and functional categories. An example would be use heading, sections, and subheadings to organize your text. Outcomes are the desired results or practices that reduce barriers. It supports ease of use in the designed content. Example would be to provide semantic structure that conveys a sense of hierarchy. One way that an individual with a vision disability will navigate content through a screen reader is using the rotor to look at the heading structure. And so the semantics that you introduce into your application become very important in allowing somebody to quickly and easily find their way around your application. The how-to documents are information about guidelines, and they're going to use plain language. What was really interesting in the creation of the silver guidelines is they actually leveraged a design sprint to try and understand where the real needs lie. And what they saw is that The accessibility guidelines did not use plain language, and they were difficult to understand and to sometimes adopt and test. So the goal with the WCAG 3.0 is to make it easier for someone to understand these guidelines, to adopt them, and to test with them. The tags are going to be applied to the guidelines and methods and really provide for findability, to allow you to be able to go in and to quickly and easily find the guideline or the method to address the conformance goal that you have. The methods are specific to technology and include sections of description, example tests, and scoring. They provide detailed techniques and tests for rating how well an outcome for technology has been met. An example would be headings, HTML, and ARIA. So are you leveraging the H tags to organize the semantic structure of your content? And are you applying the ARIA labels so that you're able to effectively communicate that to somebody using assistive technology? The scoring section informs and is used to calculate the overall score for the optional conformance claim. And the score in each functional category, as well as an overall score, determines conformance at a level of bronze. So if you are WCAG 2.2 AA compliant, that would be the same as being bronze for the 3.0 guideline. And you must have a bronze level of conformance before you can apply the holistic test to determine conformance with silver and gold. So these are the disabilities that WCAG 3.0 will be supporting. And you can see it looks at blindness and low vision, deafness and hearing loss, limited movement, speech disabilities, sensory disorders, learning disabilities, and cognitive disabilities. And really what you do when you support the accessibility for your users that may be in these categories, you are welcoming them into your product, your service, your business, and your company. And really, again, that is what it is about. Is it about providing access to as many people as possible for the products and services you provide? The additional emerging technologies that the WCAG 3.0 standard will look at is XR, augmented, virtual, and mixed reality. It will look at voice inputs. And the one area I think is going to be really interesting is the Web of Things. A lot of people today have the Ring doorbell, and you can imagine that the same way that PowerPoint on my MacBook is able to provide real-time closed captioning, when will the video on the Ring doorbell be able to do that too? It seems like that would make a lot of sense. And when you think about how many things could be smart, from your dishwasher to your oven to your light, you can start to get a sense of how this WCAG 3.0 guideline is going to apply to a broad range of technologies and industries. And again, the key point that I want to really drive home is that we are seeing an evolution of accessibility. Traditionally, the current guidelines are pretty much a pass-fail conformance measurement. You can look at a guideline, you can run an automated or manual test against content, and you can take a look at an image and see whether it has an alt tag. You can take a look at an application and see whether you can use keyboard-only navigation to move through that application. And you can then answer the question of, does your product conform to this guideline? Usability really relates to the quality, efficiency, satisfaction of the experience. It's subjective. The alt tag you applied to that image, is it intuitive? Is it understandable? The sequence that you're able to use keyboard-only navigation, is it intuitive? Is it understandable? We normally test those questions with our UX metrics like system usability scale, net promoter score, single ease question. Those are standard metrics you can use to test that. The WCAG 3.0 is going to allow you to take those types of tests from your UX research and design efforts and carry them through to also test against the assistive technologies that will allow you to ensure conformance to the different types of disabilities you want to support: vision, hearing, mobility, speech. You'll be able to test against those. And we've kind of made our way there through the use of the POUR principles. That is where it's perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. This is really just helping set the stage for truly putting measurable conformance into a guideline that will be what WCAG 3.0 is all about. So let's talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of WCAG 3.0. And there are really two types of tests that will be introduced. The atomic test is very much like what we do today. It is going to be, does that image have an alt tag? Yes. And that can be done through an automated test or through a manual test. The holistic tests are going to involve using things like views, which would be the component on the page, and then the process So think of like a login process or a checkout process. And really being able to evaluate the accessible usability of that process. That is going to involve a different measurement that's going to be more like you would use to evaluate an essay. So a rubric type of methodology. And what the Silver Committee is doing is they're creating some really detailed examples of how to do that. And they are establishing how many pages you would have to test based on how large your application or site is. So a sample size will be defined. They will also start to define for each test, what is a passing grade? Right now, the thinking is 90%. So it is really starting to get into the same way you would look at a usability score and determine what a passing grade is. You will now have that applied to the accessibility of your application. In order to get to a bronze level, you cannot have a critical failure. If someone is using a screen reader and they are blocked where they cannot move forward in that process, then you will not even achieve that bronze level of conformance. So we talked a little bit about the scope, and that again is really defined in this concept of views and processes, where the views are really about the components on the page. It could be the image, it could be the heading, it could be the text fields. And it looks at those and what are the guidelines that you need to support for those views. And then as you start looking at the process, again, it is going to be you can log in to the application. You can reset your password. You can check out from the cart. So that will become more of the new aspect that a lot of you are already doing today, right now, with your UX designs and with your A/B testing. This will now bring that into the realm of accessibility. Again, talking about the scoring will look at the atomic test. It will take a look at the outcomes that are defined. It will then bring that into an overall score and then introduce the holistic testing that will help you get to that level of silver and gold. And again, talk a little bit about the conformance levels. So that's a lot of information. And the good news is that you've got time to start getting ready for this. Again, the 2.2 working draft is available right now. These links are available for download from the Google Drive site, so you'll be able to get access to these. And again, the working draft for 2.2, you can take a look at that. You can go ahead and understand what is going to be conformance for that specific guideline. And I would encourage you to be proactive. As your design team and your development team and your QA team are continuing to work to introduce accessibility into their SDLC, it is important to be able to keep them apprised of what is coming down the pipe, to ensure that they have the runway to implement these conformance guidelines. Because A, it's the right thing to do. B, it's a smart thing to do. Just ask Domino's Pizza. They lost an accessibility lawsuit here that went to the Supreme Court. And there are roughly around about 2,500 lawsuits annually. You don't want to be one of them. The other thing you'll be able to do is get a sneak peek at the editor's draft of the WCAG 3.0. The first public working draft is scheduled to be released sometime next month. So if you want to go ahead and jump to the front of the line and take a look, I would encourage you to do that. Finally, accessibility doesn't have to be hard. One of the best web accessibility online tutorial classes I have seen is from Udacity. It was created in partnership with Google, and it's free. It's about a 2-week class with about an hour commitment a day. I really think you're going to like the class. It really gets into the developer side of accessibility, and I think it will be a really valuable training for anyone on your team to go and take a look at. And I hope that you now have an awareness of what accessibility guidelines are coming down the pipe and the tools to go and to learn more about them. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention. And I think we have a few minutes left. I'd be happy to take any questions. So I'm looking at the questions we have here in chat. So one I have from Josh is, with neurological disabilities and different types of trauma, do you foresee content warnings entering accessibility guidelines? Great question. What I have seen is there are guidelines dealing with seizures, in that the number of flashes has to be below 3 or below in order to not induce any type of seizure. I do believe that part of the cognitive disability is specifically looking at our users that may be older and experiencing some decline in cognitive abilities. I think also it is reasonable to expect that in any type of accessibility, you have a permanent, a temporary, and a situational disability. An example would be from a cognitive point would be that you have a condition, you have Alzheimer's. That would be more of a permanent one, where a temporary one maybe you have a concussion. So I think that you will end up seeing that that is something that you'll have to take a look at. Another resource I would absolutely encourage you to go take a look at, I think Microsoft did an outstanding job with their inclusive design approach. So if you just search for inclusive design, Microsoft, definitely take a look at that. Steve asked, we're redesigning our website. Which guidelines should we start with? I would start with 2.1 AA. That is the standard that has been adopted by most companies, and it is the standard that was adopted by the European Union, Canada with the Canadian Act, they WCAG 2.1 AA. I think if you were to take that standard, that would definitely serve you well to go in and focus on leveraging that one. You're welcome. So I've got a few minutes left here if anybody has any additional questions. Thank you, Peter. I appreciate it. Yeah, the one thing I want to leave you with is 20 years ago, when I got into doing UX, nobody was doing UX. And it really became something that you had to advocate for, you had to really champion. That is no longer the case. You see a lot of individuals from a lot of different parts of a lot of different backgrounds getting into UX, and it almost being universally recognized that UX is of value to the organization. I am seeing the same trend happen with accessibility. It is definitely something where it appears that there will be more of an overall enterprise approach toward accessibility. It is something that we absolutely take serious at NCR. And as we evolve from being more of your traditional ATM hardware company into being a software and services company, we are striving to bridge that experience. And it is something that we are advocating for across the entire organization of 36,000 employees and dozens and dozens of countries around the world. So I really think that this is a space that's going to continue to grow. It is going to be something that with these new standards, it is going to provide opportunities. And I think that realistically, with the introduction of 5G, the Web of Things, you're going to see more and more industries that have been maybe traditionally focused on industrial design start to see that digital accessibility is something they need to introduce into their organization. So I would absolutely encourage anybody that found this interesting and wanted to explore it in more detail, take a look at that Udacity Google training, and then go ahead and just take a few minutes and look at the guidelines that are coming out. And I think that'll inform you and your approach to what you're doing. And with that, I think we're just about at time. So just looking at what Josh says here. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very well said. So again, my contact information should be available if you are you want to get any additional information. I'm happy to share some of the tools and services I've used to help advance accessibility within our organization. And I stay safe and have a good rest of the day. Thanks, guys.